said to her then, to the town where she was dwelling, "Oh, hasten, come to my master dear, if your name be Barbara Allen." So slowly, slowly raised she up, and slowly, slowly came nigh him. And when she drew the curtain by, "Young man, I think you're dying." Sick and very, very sick, and it's all for Barbara Allen. The better for me, you see, never be, though your heart's blood were spilling. "Oh, didn't you mind, young man," says she, "when the red wine ye were filling, but ye made the health go round and round, and slighted Barbara Allen." He turned his face into the wall, and death was with him dealing. "Do adieu, my dear friends all, and be kind to Barbara Allen." She was walking over the fields, she heard the dead bell knelling, and every child the dead bell gave cried woe to Barbara Allen. "Oh, mother, mother, make my bed, oh, make it soft and narrow. My love has died for me today, I'll die for him tomorrow. Farewell," she said, "ye virgins all, and shun the fault I fell in. Henceforth take warning by the fall of cruel Barbara Allen." So, that ballad that I just sang is called Barbara Allen, and it's a traditional poetic ballad. In fact, it's one of the most famous of them. And today, I'm going to be talking about ballads, specifically poetic ballads, like the one you just heard. Now, you might be wondering what a ballad poem is, what makes a ballad poem, and why the song I just played is different from what you might think of as a ballad, why it's different from other songs. See, when I think of a ballad today, what you might think of it today, some cheesy song that some cheesy guy is singing his love to his girlfriend, or some song you might slow dance to in middle school. But ballad, specifically a ballad poem, is really different. And to understand what the word ballad poem means in its historical context, what it originally meant, all you have to do is to look at the origin of the word. You see, the word ballad comes from the French words chanson ballade, or ballade. Excuse my pronunciation, I don't speak French. But these words, chanson ballade, meant dance songs. Originally, ballad, specifically poetic ballads, ballad poetry, was listened to by people, usually common folk or peasants, in the medieval ages as entertainment at the local town tavern or at town festivals. They would be danced to and memorized and retold and retold and retold. And they have a really long and really rich history, but before I get into that, you probably need to know what a ballad poem is. In its most simple description, a ballad poem is a form of lyrical closed form poetry, which basically means that it has a pre-established form. It has certain things that the poem has to do, that it has to be in order to be a ballad poem. And lyrical, in the context of poetry, basically means that its narrative, which means its story, is set to music. Now, in order for a ballad to be considered a ballad poem, it needs to be written in a very specific form called Ballad Quatrain or Ballad Stanza. And almost all ballads that are written in the English language are written in this form, in Ballad Stanza and Ballad Quatrain. This pre-established form has really specific requirements, which come in the form of rhyme scheme, meter, subject matter, and each of the poem stanzas, which is basically the poetry equivalent of a paragraph being made up of 4 lines, which in poetry, a 4-line paragraph or 4-line stanza is called a quatrain. For example, in the ballad that I just sang, Barbara Allen, the first 4 lines, as is the rest of the stanzas within the poem, is a quatrain. It's a collection of 4 lines. "In a scarlet town where I was born, there was a fair maid dwelling, made every youth cry well away, her name was Barbara Allen." 4 lines. And some deviation is allowed from this requirements. For a poem to be in ballad stanza, it needs to adhere them pretty closely. And now that you know what the word ballad means, let's talk about what makes a ballad poem a ballad poem. Rhyme scheme, in or out of poetry, is something that a lot of us are familiar with, but if you need a reminder, rhyme scheme is basically the pattern of rhymes at the end of the lines in a paragraph, or as I said, a stanza within poetry. And the rhyme scheme of a ballad quatrain is typically either A, B, C, B, or somewhat less commonly A, B, A, B. Though as I said before, this can be a little flexible. When a poem has A, B, C, B as its rhyme scheme, it means that the first line, which is represented by the lowercase letter A, and the third line, which is represented by the lowercase letter C of the stanza, which as I said before is equivalent to a paragraph within poetry, are unrhymed. But the second and the fourth lines, both represented by the lowercase letter B, rhyme with each other. When a poem has A, B, A, B as its rhyme scheme, it means that the first and the third lines rhyme with each other, which are represented by the letter A, and the second and the fourth lines rhyme with each other, both represented by the letter B. And these rhymes can either be true rhymes, four rhymes, which means that they are true rhymes, like goat and moat, or toe and throw. Or they can be slant rhymes, near rhymes, like crate and braid, down and profound, which kind of rhyme with each other. Now, in the ballad I just sang, the rhyme scheme actually switches between A, B, A, B, and A, B, C, B, which is actually not terribly uncommon within ballad poetry. In the first quatrain, which if you remember is, in a scarlet town where I was born, there was a fair maid dwelling, made every youth cry well away, her name was Barbara Allen. This stanza has an A, B, C, B rhyme scheme. The words born and way don't rhyme with each other, but dwelling and Allen are near rhymes. For example, quatrain 2, the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B. All in the merry month of May, when green buds they were swelling, young Jemmy Grove on his deathbed lay for love of Barbara Allen. May and lay rhyme with each other perfectly, they're true rhymes, and Allen and swellin are near rhymes. Now that you know what a rhyme scheme is in poetry, let's move on to meter. Meter, in or out of poetry, is pretty simple, and it's also something that a lot of us might be familiar with also. All meter means in poetry is a pattern of rhythm within poetry, with this rhythm being the pattern of unstressed syllables and stressed syllables. There are many different types of meter, with the different types being named through the different patterns of stresses. A ballad quatrain's meter is iambic, which means each line's pattern is unstressed, stressed. Each of the ballad stanza's 4 lines is in a pattern of da, da, with the second syllable being stressed. For example, in our poem Barbara Allen, which is also iambic, which it has to be because ballad poems have to be iambic to be in ballad quatrain, he sent his man into her then, which is the first line of the third quatrain, and the meter is really clear here. You can hear it. He sent his man into her then. The stress appears on the second syllable each time, and it appears 4 times, which means this line is an iambic tetrameter. An iambic tetrameter means that your pattern of da-da appears 4 times in your lines. Now, ballad quatrain's meter, which again is iambic, typically has 2 variations in which it appears. The first variation is called 8 and 8ths. This means that the 4 lines of each stanza is in iambic tetrameter. Again, this means that there are 4 iambs per line for da-das. And this variation is called 8 and 8ths because there are 8 syllables per line of each stanza of each quatrain. The second variation is called 8 and 6ths. This means that the 4 lines of each stanza have an alternating pattern of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. This means that line 1 and line 3 have 4 iambs for da-das, and line 2 and line 4 have 3 iambs, 3 da-das. A great example of a poem that is in 8 and 6ths is a ballad poem called Bonnie John Sutton. This poem is really, really old. In fact, it's actually a folk ballad, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. And the first stanza, which is in 8 and 6ths, reads as follows. Upon the 18th day of June, a dreary day to see, the southern lords did pitch their camp just at the bridge of Dee. This quatrain is pretty obviously in 8 and 6ths. Now, a ballad poem can deviate from these forms and sometimes switch up its meter at the end of the line, but as I said before, for a ballad poem to be considered a ballad poem, it needs to mostly follow these rhyme schemes in this meter. Finally, the subject matter. It's usually pretty simple. The subject matter of a ballad is usually of love, adventure, heartbreak, or religion, and sometimes all of them combined. For example, the Barbara Allen, the ballad I just sung, is a story of heartbreak. One of our main characters, young Jemmy Grove, dies of heartbreak because of Barbara Allen. To sum it up, ballad poetry is written in 4-line stanzas, quatrain, that rhymes A-B-C-B, or sometimes A-B-A-B. That is either written in 4 lines of iambic tetrameter, called 8 and 8s, or 4 lines of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter, called 8 and 6s, and that it is of a story that is typically about love, adventure, heartbreak, or all of these things combined. And now that you know the sort of basic definition of a ballad poem, I'm going to talk about different types of ballad poems. Now, as with any form of poetry or any form of literature, any form of media, there's a lot of different types of ballad poetry. But today, I'm going to just be focusing on 2 types, and these types are called folk ballads and literary ballads. Now, folk ballads, also called early ballads, are the earliest form of ballad poetry, and actually just one of the earliest forms of poetry in general. Folk ballads, as forms of written poetry, began in the 13th or 14th century, but the tradition of folk ballads is much, much older. See, folk ballads came into creation as oral poetry, spoken poetry. And since many people were illiterate in the 13 and 1400s, or earlier, some were never written down until much later. In fact, many were never written down. And as oral poetry, they didn't even necessarily have to be, since they were spoken. This means that we aren't fully sure when they started happening as poetic tradition, when folk ballads began as a tradition within it, as an oral tradition, but we do know that it's really, really old. Now, as I said before, folk ballads were a form of entertainment to be sung in the evenings or on special holidays or in town festivals for tired, hard-working people, peasants. They were sung by troubadours, bards, traveling musicians, and sometimes, usually, just all-around people, all-around peasants. And since these songs were sung by so many different people, so many different times, and some, or most, were never really written down until much, much later in history, it's really hard, or oftentimes, many times, impossible to find the author of a folk ballad. In a way, there isn't even really one author, but rather many, many, many authors over hundreds of years. Since these poems would be retold, written and rewritten, and changed or have a part replaced, they likely existed, and they do, in many multiple forms, in multiple versions. Once these poems are finally written down, if they ever were, because many have been lost, these poems would have many different versions. For example, our folk ballad that I just sang, Barbara Allen, has many different versions also. In some, our main male character, if you remember, is called Jemmy Grove, which is the one I sang. In others, he's called Sweet William. To further that point, I actually came up with the tune and the chords to my version of Barbara Allen, and this kind of shows you that as long as you keep the basic meter and the basic story and the basic rhyme scheme, you can kind of do whatever you want to the song, as long as it reflects the basic story and the basic meter. And though there are many different versions, most folk ballads are often similar to each other. The versions that exist of these folk ballads of Barbara Allen are similar to each other. This is because, though many were never written down until much, much later, they were usually pretty easy to memorize. See, as humans, we love strong rhythm. We love to dance, and we love fun rhymes, simple but good lyrics, constant repetition, and entertaining and appealing stories. And folk ballads had all of this. Folk ballads have strong, consistent meter because they were meant to be sung and danced to. They have language and content that was easily memorized, retold, and understood because many of the people who sung these ballads, danced these ballads, were illiterate and needed, in a way, basic language to understand or relate to. And the folk ballads' content was easily memorized, easily retold, and understood by the masses, who are often illiterate, as I said. And these folk ballads, they have parts that are repeated over and over again, called refrains, so that the important information of these ballads, it was remembered, and it was enforced, so these stories would be remembered. they can really stick with you. These stories of heartbreak and love, which many people can relate to, they really stuck with you in your memory. Some great examples of folk ballads are in the Child Ballads, which is a collection of 305 English and Scottish folk ballads from a wide range of historic eras, many from the Middle Ages, collected by Francis James Child, who was a specialist in really early English literature and language. A great example of a folk ballad that was part of the Child Ballads is the Cherry Tree Carol, which is number 54 of the Child Ballads. And to put it simply, this poem tells a story of Mary, as in the mother of Jesus, asking Joseph, who was her husband, to pick some fruit for her. When Joseph refuses, Jesus, who's still in her womb, tells the tree to bend so that she can pick some fruit. And this is a simple story. This is a great reflection of a folk ballad because it's a simple story of religious nature, which many folk ballads were of. It is in a clear iambic meter. It has a rhyme scheme of ABCB, which, as I said before, is a really classical, common rhyme scheme of Ballad Quatrain. And it's pretty obviously in Ballad Quatrain. And the poem reads as follows. The Cherry Tree Carol. Joseph was an old man, and an old man was he, when he wedded Mary in the land of Galilee. Joseph and Mary walked through an orchard good, where was cherries and berries, so red as any blood. Joseph and Mary walked through an orchard green, where was berries and cherries as thick as might be seen. Oh, then bespoke Mary, so meek and so mild, pluck me one cherry, Joseph, for I am with child. Oh, then bespoke Joseph, with words most unkind, let him pluck that cherry that brought him thee with child. Oh, then bespoke the babe within his mother's womb, bow down then the tallest tree, for my mother to have some. Then bowed down the highest tree unto his mother's hand. Then she cried, see, Joseph, I have cherries at command. Oh, then bespake Joseph, I have done Mary wrong, but cheer up, my dearest, and be not cast down. Then Mary plucked a cherry as red as the blood. Then Mary went home with her heavy load. Then Mary took her babe and sat him on her knee, saying, my dear son, tell me what this world will be. Oh, I shall be as dead, mother, as the stones in the wall. Oh, the stones in the streets, mother, shall mourn for me all. Upon Easter day, mother, my uprising shall be. Oh, the sun and the moon, mother, shall both rise with me. Really great classical example of a folk ballad, and pretty intense sounding. And now that you know what a ballad is, what a poetic ballads form is, what a folk ballad is, let's talk about the folk ballad's child in a way, the literary ballad. The literary ballad was the revival of the ballad tradition within the 18th and 19th centuries. You see, poets from the 18th and 19th centuries really liked the form of the folk ballad and wanted to mimic that form, but also wanted to write ballads that were a little more complex, a little more elaborate, and a little more regular in meter, because as I said before, the meter of folk ballads can sometimes deviate a little bit. These literary poems were written by intellectuals, particularly those in the Romantic movement, which was a movement in the late 1700s to mid-1800s that emphasized emotions within and out of nature. These Romantic poets really liked the strong emotions that existed within traditional ballads, within these traditional stories that many people could relate to of love and heartbreak. And literary ballads can only exist within their original form, the form written by the poet. Because these poems weren't part of an oral tradition, they didn't have any flexibility in the way they were written, the way they were told. One and only one version of these poems were correct. These poems were carefully and mindfully crafted by poets, rather than hundreds of years of interpretation and reinterpretations by minstrels and peasants. That is the biggest difference between folk ballads and literary ballads, is that folk ballads can exist in many forms, while literary ballads can only exist within their original form. One ballad can only be one ballad, while folk ballads, one ballad can be in forms of many ballads. They, like folk ballads, also tell stories. Both of these type of ballads tell stories. A quintessential example of a literary ballad is La Belle Dame sans Merci. Mercy? The Beautiful Lady Without Mercy. And again, pardon my French. And this was written in 1819 by English poet John Keats, who was a very prominent figure within the Romantic movement. And you can tell that this poem is a literary ballad because, although it's in Ballad Quatrain, it's a little more complex. The language is more complex. The story is more complex. It has more regular meter than a folk ballad. And also, to be honest, it's a little bit less easily memorized. Folk ballads were very easily memorized, as I said, because they weren't written down and they needed to be remembered, while literary ballads were written down, so they didn't really need to kind of parse down their language. And to summarize the story, a knight falls in love with a beautiful and mysterious elfin woman who ultimately leaves him to an unpleasant fate of heartbreak and bad health. This poem, as all other ballad poems, is in iambic meter because, as I said, for a ballad to be a poetic ballad, it needs to be in Ballad Quatrain, which is an iambic meter. And it tells the story of love and the supernatural, which are quite common themes within ballad poems. It has a rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B. And the poem reads as follows. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, so haggard and so woe begone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest's done. I see a lily on thy brow with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy's song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore. There I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses four. And there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide! The latest dream I ever dreamt on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La belle dame, sans mercy, thee hath in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hillside. This is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. So, as you can see, and wow, what a quite a sad poem. As you can see, literary and folk ballads are quite alike. And obviously in the Ballad Quatrain, they have their similarities. They have similarities within rhyme scheme, but they also have a difference within language. Barbara Allen was quite a simple poem, if you really think about it. There weren't really words that were hard to understand, except because of the antiquity of the language. But in The Lady Without Mercy, The Beautiful Lady Without Mercy, it was a little more complicated, and I'd say it was even a little more complicated for the time, just because Keats liked the language to be. Now, to wrap it up, ballad poems actually, in a way, are pretty simple. Their language isn't usually too hard, unless, like the poem I read above, which also wasn't too hard, but unless it's a literary ballad. Their rhymes are usually pretty simple and easy to memorize because they had to be in order to be sung, and their stories are those that are entertaining and sometimes relatable, sometimes not, as in our fairies and the undead. And ballad poems have proven to themselves to be a really great way to tell stories. After all, as humans, we love music, we love dancing, and we love a good plot line, which basically makes ballad poetry irresistible. And to conclude this video, I'm actually going to read one more ballad for you. And this is The Three Ravens, also called the Twa Corbies in the Scots language, which is number 26 of the Child Ballads. As all other Child Ballads, this is a folk ballad rather than a literary ballad, and specifically an English folk ballad. I'm going to be reading just one version of this ballad, because of course, as with many, many other folk ballads, there are many multiple versions with many different words and meters, well, not meters, but a lot of different versions. So, this is the Twa Corbies. There were 3 ravens sat on a tree. They were as black as they might be. The one of them said to his mate, "Where shall we our breakfast take?" "Down in yonder green field. There lies a knight slain under his shield. His hounds they lie down at his feet, so well they can their master keep. His hawks they fly so eagerly, there's no fowl dare come him nigh. Down there comes a fallow doe, as great with young as she might go. She lifts up his bloody head, and kissed his wounds that were so red. She got him up upon her back, and carried him to earth in lack. She buried him before the prime. She was dead herself ere even song time. God send every gentleman such hawks, such hounds, and such a lemon." Pretty great example of a folk ballad. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a little bit today. And if you didn't, I hope you liked the ballads because they're pretty great. Thank you.